Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Covenant Cast, where we discuss the past, present, and future of the tabletop gaming industry. I'm Zach.
And I'm Steven, and today it's another entry into the Power 7 series. We're talking about game mechanics that can go one way or another, and oftentimes one way only. We're talking to Alex Davy today about silver bullets. These are cards that answer very specific interactions or other very specific powerful cards generally, and presume to solve the problem. We're going to talk to Alex because he's a known designer in our orbit, most notably for Star Wars X-Wing and then later Star Wars Legion, and has since found his way to none other than WizKids, one of the originals. So we can't wait to talk to Alex. We hope you'll join us. Stay tuned. Alex, it's great to have you here. We're gonna kick things off with a quick story to introduce Silver Bullets, your official topic, and then of course we would like to hear officially how you're doing and what work you're engaged in, etc. But here's what happened. So I'm playing Lord of the Rings trading card game, an absolute classic. You're a fan,
yeah.
right?
Huge fan. I think that's the to my mind the best game that Decipher ever made. Loved that game. Absolutely loved that game.
Okay, so let me set the stage for you. We're playing. We started the second block on the stream. We've opened the first of the two towers, which is what?
Two towers.
It's just called two towers, right? And so you can play like Dunlendings and Rohan shows up for the first time and this kind of thing. And I get attracted to Rohan, of course. Movement and like exertion and stuff, and horses. Great, love it.
Noble horse folk. What's not to like?
Yeah, right. It's perfect. So get a couple of pulls and we're opening one box, right? And so I get the card that's like, if you have Gandalf, Theoden gets really awesome. You can attach it to him. He gets great. I get a sword. Theoden's sword is great. We've got the site where you can go get Theoden from the deck on site 3. Awesome. So like I'm building this entire deck around this thing and I'm having the time of my life. And can you imagine on site 2, I draw my hand.
I think I know exactly where this is going.
It's all of the best Theoden cards you can imagine. You get the sword, you get everything. It's amazing. And so I'm like, I could double move here, but I'm not going to do it. I go to site 3. It's the throne room. We're going to get Theoden. We're going to put all this stuff on him. You know what happens? I do it. I complete my objective. Theoden and Éomer are built to the teeth. They've got horses. They've got swords. They've got like the king's mail or whatever. I'm like feeling incredible. And then I move on to site 4, of course, now being the king of the world. And, got to exert to go there because it's like the city, the mountain pass or whatever it is, White Mountains. And then, Zach gets a bunch of Twilight because I played a lot of stuff. And so then
you went for
it. he drops out this 14 strength South Run thing that says if I have 7 or more companions, he gets to just discard anything he wants off of my board companion. What was it called? You remember that? Southern?
Yeah, I don't remember the name. I don't remember the name of it. Yeah.
And as it turns out, I have 8 companions, if you can believe it.
So I got to do it twice.
I have 8 companions. And so
there goes Gandalf, there goes Theoden.
There goes Theoden, there goes Éomer. So both horse people immediately gone, and I'm left with a ragtag fellowship to complete the game. Mm-hmm. Now, the immediate reaction, of course, is one of obscene disappointment. And feeling like something had happened, something had gone wrong. I didn't know what was going to happen. How is this possible that you can just discard an awesome companion that I've invested so much in? And the chat's reaction is, well, they had to do that because having a bunch of the fellowship was just too strong. So this is a mechanic that answers that. And if it's not in the game, then the companion or the fellowship just wins every time because they play all these cheap companions, which introduces our topic, which is effectively cards that answer very specific scenarios or problems in a game's development specifically. And this was one of those cards that, chat's basically saying this needs to exist to keep these other things in check. And that's the sole reason that it was added to the card pool. So kick us off.
There's one of those
here.
In Fellowship Block too. Ulare Contea had a similar mechanic where he would hit the board, and if you had more than, or no, was it Enquia? No, yeah, it was Enquia, Ulare Enquia. He would hit the board and he could wound people if you had more than 5 companions. So, and so he was in every deck as a one-off at least, because even if you were playing Moria Orcs or Urukai or whatever, he was such a valuable tool.
Yeah.
And the chat's totally right. I mean, I actually, weirdly enough, this is a weirdly perfect story because I was extremely into the competitive scene of LOTR TCG. I went to the first Worlds. I won the North Dakota State Championships, which should be taken with a grain of salt because North Dakota is very small. But nevertheless, I was heavily.
But we still have a
invested,
state
right?
champion with us.
Yeah. I literally still have my decaying, decrepit championship card binder full of old TCG cards that says LOTR champion. It's got a picture of Sauron on the front. It came with a tattoo, a temporary tattoo that says fierce. It was amazing.
Yes.
Stephen put one of those on last week.
I just put one of those on that was in a booster box that we opened. So tell me.
I still have like 3 or 4 of those lying around somewhere. Maybe I'll wear them next time I'm out in Tulsa.
It will get you pretty far. It'll get you real far.
This dude must be fierce.
This guy's fierce.
That's right. Right.
So given your experience with the game, given your experience with Silver Bullets, given your experience with Netrunner, given your experience with X-Wing, what do you think about Silver Bullets in general as a mechanic, and is it worth having at all? Why or why not?
I'm going to say yes, but then I'm going to deploy an extremely long list of caveats. As is
Let's go.
So the thing about Silver Bullets in my experience is they usually crop up as hot fixes, right? They usually crop up as a way to take a hammer to a problem. And when they are deployed in that fashion, it's a rather inelegant approach. It leads to the kind of super feels bad that, because by the way, I have that exact Theoden deck. It's really fun to give him his sword and make him sweet. And I can imagine the pain that I can feel your pain because you did a cool thing and then it was immediately taken away from you. And it was taken away from you not by a fundamental game mechanic, but by a part of the card pool that I have to assume you didn't even know existed. And that's the issue a lot of times too. A lot of these Silver Bullets end up being something that a competitive player understands they need to think about and worry about, and they understand, when to do things and what they might have to consider. But if it comes out and you're a more casual player and you had no idea that you made a mistake, I mean, you didn't know that playing your 7th companion was a mistake. It was, given the way that, Decipher designed some mitigating factors to try to combat giant fellowships, but you had no way of knowing that. And that to me is sort of the fundamental poor design of that kind of very specific Silver Bullet. On the flip side, it's really tough to just leave a game unbalanced. And I'm speculating here because just using my experience as a developer on a specific thematic property, there are certain considerations that you need to think about when you're trying to fix things. And of course, the easiest thing to do, and probably the most wholesome and sensible and just generally sane choice to make as a balancing factor, would have been to limit the number of fellowship characters to 6 in the rules, or 5, or whatever it is that they felt like the sweet spot was. But you can't do that because it's the 9 people in the fellowship, right? Like and that, I guarantee you that conversation happened. And the game was designed with the idea that, sure, maybe you will play 9 fellowship members. I mean, that's in the rules. I think you can play 9 and that's it. No more, no less. So that's kind of a non-starter from a thematic standpoint, right? Like, and it's a shame because the kind of, okay, you can play 9 people, but we're going to just punish you ridiculously for it, is not a good solution to that problem, right? Like, and that's the problem with Silver Bullets in general. I will segue into, I guess, criticizing some of my own work because I feel like that's only fair, right? Fair is fair. And I'll talk a little bit about Hotfixes and X-Wing and why that didn't go well.
I was just about to go right there, so I'm excited you took yourself there.
No. I'm taking myself there because I'm extremely cognizant of some of the mistakes that I made as one of the main developers on X-Wing, and dealing with an environment that, similar to a card game, was not at that point going to allow us to change much text or change costs or do any of the things that I pushed myself and Frank and Max and everybody pushed for in X-Wing 2.0. And I think the biggest problem with the core X-Wing design was that munitions, missiles, torpedoes, and bombs were not useful. They're a huge part of Star Wars lore. The proton torpedo is iconic. It's part of one of the biggest moments in Star Wars, cinematic history. It's the culmination of the first film. It's a big deal. Mathematically, they were garbage. They just were terrible. They cost 4 points, which was a huge chunk of your squad. They were one shots, so you only got one chance. And oftentimes they were so mathematically bad that it was better just to shoot with your regular 3 attack dice and a target lock, because you had to spend the target lock to roll 4 dice, which was actually statistically worse than 3 dice with a target lock. So they had absolutely no reason to exist. And they were a complete trap. And that's the other thing, right? Like you never want to design a card that is going to be a wrong choice just for existing. And unfortunately, that's where missiles and torpedoes were. I don't know if the core set designers overestimated the value of critical hits or something, or just didn't quite put together that because you had to spend the target lock to fire them, the numbers were off. But essentially, nobody took them, and if you did take them, you were even had they been free, they may have been a poor choice, right? So that's a huge problem. However, the way that we went about fixing that problem was not better. Right? So we did so many things, right? We came out with extra munitions, which gave you more shots. We came out with munitions failsafe, which meant if you missed your shot, you didn't lose your upgrade card. We came out with myriad pilot abilities that held bombs, torpedoes. We were really trying to fix this mechanic. And a better approach, of course, would have just been to scrap it all and start again. Right. Take every missile, torpedo, and bomb out of the game, throw them in the trash, and print new ones that actually work. Right. Print them with multiple charges. This is eventually, of course, what we did in 2.0, and I think mostly effectively. I think munitions in 2.0 pretty much work. But for those previously mentioned thematic reasons, that's kind of a non-starter. You can't just say, okay, well, proton torpedoes were a dud. We're just going to make better, advanced proton torpedoes that function better, and proton torpedoes will never be played because, So that was one of the reasons we tried to fix, and other things like, people own cards, they bought products. You don't want to tell them. We didn't really want to ban anything. We didn't want to tell people just put all that stuff back in your binder. You shouldn't be playing with it anyway. There are considerations of people's collections and stuff to think about too. But can
you tell me, Alex, real quick before we move too far past it? Why is it? I think this is a fascinating little nugget of a designer wisdom, if you will. Why is it that it would be better to scrap it and start over than build, let's say, 3, 4, 5 upgrades that you can take that would effectively, if you did it right, make them better? Like you have a 0 cost upgrade that's +1 to proton torpedoes. You have a 0 cost upgrade that gives them 2 munitions. Why is that approach worse than starting over?
A lot of reasons. There's sort of just the inherent clunkiness of it. It's hard to guide people, especially more casual players, through this idea of like, hey, that thing you bought in box number 1 is bad, but if you buy box number 3, 7, and 8, now it's good. That was a big mistake. That was a mistake in the approach, and it came out of good intentions, which was to fix a mechanic that wasn't working and to give people, because we would hear from fans, hey, I wish missiles and torpedoes and bombs were cool. It's a cool part of squadron combat. I really wish that they were an effective choice in the game. And it's hard to argue with that. As an extremely reasonable and understandable feeling to have. And it's one that I shared. So, we also had to consider what were the tools available to us, right? There were certain in-company restrictions and ideas at Fantasy Flight at the time that channeled us into a certain path. One of those ideas was, we will not ban cards. We will not restrict cards. We will not errata cards unless they are actually broken as a game, like if they do not function. Like they literally do not function. They're written wrong, or there was a mistake or something like that. Thou shalt not use errata to solve balance problems. So from a sort of, company standpoint, we couldn't just really start again. At least we would have had a hard time arguing that case, right? Like maybe we should have pushed for that harder. Maybe we should have just let missiles be sort of mediocre and slowly come out with better missiles and torpedoes. That's probably if I could do it over again, I probably would have just slowly come out with actually usable upgrade cards. So the reason that's a better approach in my mind than putting out all of these additional cards is twofold. One of those reasons is complexity, and needing to put a whole bunch of things onto one thing to make the first thing good. That just feels very clunky. It is very clunky. And the other thing is, it requires you to collect those things across multiple products, which is bad. It's hard to do that. You can't guarantee that everybody will buy everything, and nor should you force them to. And then finally, because of the nature of the way things are written, it is way less flexible to try to fix something after the fact than to just write it correctly from the beginning, right? Because there were so many things wrong with the proton torpedo, right? We would have had to come out with, and we eventually kind of almost did this, which is the really sad thing, but we would have had to come out with like 3 different fixes for it just to get it to where it should have been in the first place, right? And the nice thing with hindsight is that like we now know what those things were, right? And here are the 3 things that it needed. Number 1, needed to cost less. Full stop. Too expensive. That's easy. Number 2, should not have spent the target lock. You should have needed the target lock to fire it, but spending the lock takes the math into the place where it's just not usable. And finally, it needed more than 1 shot. And to give all of those things to the humble proton torpedo via upgrade cards, maybe we could have written 1 upgrade card that did all of that stuff, and probably should have. But because we weren't quite sure what effect it would have, first we came out with the 1 fix, then we came out with the other fix, and then we came out with the 3rd thing. And sure, eventually when you piled all of those things together, you had a usable proton torpedo, but was it worth it, right? That's the question. And so that's kind of the fundamental issue with hotfixes. It's a long-winded way of saying, like, if you are scrambling to solve something after the fact, it's probably automatically going to be an inelegant, clunky kludge that ends up feeling like some sort of crazy Rube Goldberg device rather than an elegant foundational design.
So in these instances, right, and I think about a lot of examples of things that I had the joy of experiencing in X-Wing. But
wow, that's a loaded.
I'm bracing myself, like, what?
No, it's really.
Are we talking about the jump master? What's going to happen?
Oh man, I still one of my favorite pictures ever is Frank watching like the finals of an X-Wing finals. He's standing there judging it, and he's just got this like 1,000-yard stare going. And it was like after you guys had done several rounds of like trying to fix things, and the jump master was still a problem. Anyways, we won't go there. The thing I was gonna say is, you mentioned clunkiness, and I think it's easy to appreciate why, 4 upgrade cards on a single ship is clunkier to make proton torpedoes work than just proton torpedoes being good. But on top of that, are there long-term, like when you've been through the ringer, I think, on a few of these games, are there other downsides to using these silver bullets as a balancing mechanic beyond just the clunkiness of it? Like what What else stems from that in your experience?
I'll even tag team on this. Like even cards like Plastic Carapace, let's say.
That I'm going to cut you off right there because that's on my list. We're going to talk a lot about Plastic Carapace.
Yeah, so that's a great example of like, okay, so what's the downside? Because these are hot fixes that are happening, set by set or release by release. And they can effectively stop something from being too strong or too good, kind of, if you're running it. So to Zach's question, right? So what are some of the other downsides that you see aside from just the clunkiness of making something have a lot of cards involved?
So yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up Plastic Carapace because that is the quintessential old school silver bullet. It stops one thing and one thing only.
Can you explain that card to me? As someone who doesn't play Netrunner. I mean, I play Netrunner, but people listening, a lot of people listening probably haven't.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just from background. So one of the win conditions in Netrunner is to do something called meat damage. Meat damage, basically, for each meat damage, you lose a card in your hand. If you have no cards to lose, you are defeated. You lose the game. Instant loss. And one of the core strategies of early Netrunner was a 2-card combo called SCA Source and Scorched Earth. SCA Source would leverage your economic power to do something called Tag the Runner, which gave them a debuff essentially, but it also opened up the ability to play hate cards on them in the form of Scorched Earth. So Scorched Earth did 4 meat damage. The combo was, I let you run at my server. I try to tax you just enough that I can land my SCA source and then have 8 credits left over, or 6 credits. I think it was 6 credits left over to do Scorched Earth, because your hand's only 5 cards. If I hit you with 8 meat damage, you die. Pretty nasty strategy. And that was a nasty part of the game for a couple of reasons, because again, it caught new players very unaware. They're trying to do the game. So the game of Netrunner involves running servers and stealing agendas. You have to do that as the runner to win, unless you have some sort of crazy, goofy, out there strategy from, mid to late Netrunner, but that's a whole other story. Early Netrunner, the core of the game is supposed to be run servers, steal stuff. Corporation bluffs, you call their bluff, you build your rig, you overcome their defenses, you steal their stuff, you win. C-Source, Scorched Earth, punished you for playing the game. And that was a core problem to begin with. The solution for that problem was also pretty rough, because the meta at the time, and just basically the way the card pool shook out and the way things were designed, there really was only 1 or 2 decks that were actually running the meat damage kill. They're all running the same combo. It was all the same thing. It was a one-hit kill. It was I'm going to build this death machine and then hit you with it. But there were a lot of other competitive decks that weren't doing that at all. They weren't interfacing with meat damage. They weren't involved in that mechanic whatsoever, because it was not a core mechanic for every corporation. It was a niche mechanic that NBN and Wayland, 2 of the main factions of the game, would utilize. But there were 2 other factions that barely used it at all. So Plastic Carapace is a card that's very simple. It simply says, put 4 power counters on Plastic Carapace when it's installed. When there's no power counters left on Plastic Carapace, trash it, so discard it. And then you could spend a power counter to prevent 1 meat damage. That seems pretty innocuous, right? You're worried about meat damage. You put this card in your deck, it gives you a Carapace against these hits. Well, the problem with this kind of silver bullet is deck space in any competitive card game is limited. And you never want to put a card in that's going to be a dead draw against, many matchups. In fact, probably the majority of your matchups. I certainly played tournaments where I had a 2 or 3 Plastic Carapace deck that never played against Wayland. And then you would draw Plastic Carapace and you would have, literally, it could have been a blank card, because it just choked your deck. It just clogged it up. It did not accomplish anything. So that, to my mind, is the example of, and it's like circles of protection, right? That's another example from ancient history, early Magic. These are cards that would protect you against a specific color. If your opponent's not playing that color, it doesn't do anything. And that kind of brings me to my third point, which was because Plascrete Carapace was so strong, it also made the whole tag and bag strategy a really all or nothing thing. It was very, very difficult to ever win a game against someone who was packing Plascrete Carapaces. So instead of what should have been a really interesting back and forth, it was rock, paper, scissors, or it was, Scorched Earth, Plascrete Carapace. I didn't decide to play this game, right? Like those were the three options. And sure, there were other things that you could do to beat a Scorched Earth deck. You could make more money than they had, so they couldn't tag you. You could figure out some sort of tag removal system, and that was eventually what the game moved towards, was ways to shake tags instead of prevent meat damage, because tags were a little more universal as a threat, and that was a better solution to the problem. Right? Let's give runners a difficult way to remove these tags so that but it doesn't totally shut them down. So that it's not just, hey, I play Plascrete Carapace and now your combo's gone, right? You can't. You would have to hit me with 3 Scorched Earths to get through the Carapace, and there's literally only 3 clicks in a corpse turn. You can't do that. So that's the problem. It was a fix that only applied to one small thing. It completely negated the win potential of that thing. And it was a real feels bad to have to include in your decks just in case. And I eventually personally moved towards never playing it. But I lost 2 tournaments on the final table to Seesaw Scorched Earth. And I was like, well, cool. Guess I should have brought that damn Carapace.
What would you say then, Alex, to people? Because you hear this a lot too. It's like, well, I mean, that's kind of the whole point of deck building and having to make difficult decisions and, choosing your percentages against this deck or that deck, that already exists to some degree. So like, why is such an extreme example like Plascrete so bad? Doesn't that make for an interesting decision-making process when you're deck building and deciding on what metagame you're attacking?
No, it does not.
Yes, I love it.
Well, that solves that.
It just doesn't.
We're done here.
Well, I'll extrapolate, right? And it depends on the game, right? I think a game with a sideboard, it's a more palatable choice. If Netrunner had a sideboard, they could have created a weaker version of Plascrete Carapace that probably nobody put in their main deck. But if Plascrete Carapace was cheaper to play and gave you only 2 counters or something like that, so they could kind of chip away at it before getting the kill shot. Well, now that's some mitigation, but it's not super strong. It still gives Wayland a way to actually get their win condition. It doesn't sit in your deck as a dead draw. It's in your sideboard if you need it. Netrunner didn't have a sideboard, and because of the way the math on these things worked out, dead draws were hugely crippling in Netrunner. You lost your momentum. Having played a lot of very competitive Netrunner, like every card was precious. I mean, that's any card game really, but like particularly so in a game where you need to race against the corporation to win, because you are on the back. If you cannot get there faster, you lose. So there's not time to draw cards that don't have utility. There's no wiggle room there. So that's a mitigating factor, right? Like had Plascrete been less powerful and been a possible sideboard option, that would have been a different story. You see that a lot in Magic. There are cards that are hate cards and that are specific silver bullet counters, but there's a sideboard mechanic. And even having said all of that, generally speaking, those silver bullets have some additional utility, right? They're not just stopping one thing. They're specifically tuned against specific decks, archetypes, colors, creatures, etc. But that is not all they do, right? If there is a card that removes your enemy's graveyard, it probably does something else too. Or if there's a card that gives you -1/-1 counters to get around things like invulnerable and this, that, or the other thing, like it probably costs more to compensate, or not. So the basic idea is that your card should not be so narrow that it only works against one thing. It should not work against that one thing so spectacularly well that it is an auto include or just such a feels bad, like the Southern, I forget what was this, the Southern card that discards people.
Yeah,
that's
like a Southern
so
Commander or something.
Brutal, right? And otherwise, that card was pretty useless, as I recall. It was a crazy expensive minion that you didn't really want to play unless they were bringing Chonk Fellowships. And
that's exactly right.
So it's that's the kind of thing that feels bad. I think Ulare Enquia was a better version of that kind of silver bullet. Or yeah, it was Enquia, because Ulare Enquia was a reasonable drop, regardless of whether they had a fat fellowship. It was fierce. It was not nearly as expensive. It was more limited in scope. And it was a better way to implement that too, because they could still choose to play a large fellowship if they were okay with taking 3 wounds in that fellowship. So they could play a big fatty Gandalf and go to 6, knowing that Ulare Enquia couldn't just slap Gandalf off the board. He'd have to settle for Gimli or Legolas or someone with fewer wounds. Or you would make sure that all your guys had 4 wounds. There were a lot of, and he couldn't target the ring bearer. There were a lot of reasons that Ulare Enquia was a better designed card than Southern Commander. And I don't have a huge problem with Ulare Enquia because of that reason, because it has inherent utility, because it is not quite so ludicrously strong. It's much more palatable to be in there as a counter mechanic. And the other thing about big fellowships is it's not like they didn't think about this. There are tons of rules in the TCG that are geared towards encouraging small fellowships or smaller fellowships. Don't get too big, right? The Twilight mechanic, the various sites that punish you for having bigger fellowships. The problem is it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to offset the massive advantages of just pump. I mean, I went to Worlds. So here's actually a good Lord of the Rings story. I went to Worlds with this dumb little deck. This is the deck that I won the North Dakota State Championships with. It only had 3 companions. It had Frodo, Gandalf, and Sam. And it had stuff like Depart Silently, Hobbit Stealth, Shoulder to Shoulder? No, that was the Legolas Gimli busted card that just shot everything before they errated it. No, it was a Promise. It's a card called a Promise that, Frodo and Sam, while neither of them is exhausted, they each get +1 strength. And there were Rosie Cotton was in there. Basically, the strategy of the deck was sneak to Site 6, because at Sites 1 to 5, all your Hobbit Stealths and Gandalf Staffs and whatnot let you just evade combat. So the real beautiful trick was you just dash to Site 5. They play a billion minions and a Balrog, whatever it is, right? You play Depart Silently. It prevents hobbits from being assigned to skirmishes at all. Normally that's a huge problem, but with Gandalf's staff, there is now one combat. It's everyone versus Gandalf, and Gandalf says, "No, we're not fighting today." And you exert him twice and they cancel everything. Beautiful deck. Love that deck. Gimmick deck.
You got to kind of love that thematically, though.
Right? Yeah. The problem is, as fun as that was, when I got to the big boy tables at Worlds, they just played 8 billion guys. And if I didn't draw my combo pieces, it was not reliable. I think I lost all but 1 game. And when I actually got to the big kids table out of North Dakota meta and playing against the actual meta decks. The meta decks, every single one of them played big old fellowships. Big fellowships. Play your Ulare Enquia, whatever. I'll lose a guy. I'll just play another one. Because not only were they playing as many people as they could draw, they were playing more than 9 characters in their deck, so that if someone died, oh well. Just play, Boromir. Gimli's dead, whatever. Here comes whoever I drew, right? So
bodies.
Bodies. And that was a miscalculation on the part of the Decipher design team, because despite thinking about this and despite designing a wonderful game that I love, big fellowships were too strong, and they were fundamentally unbalanced from the core of the game. And that increasingly became an issue as the game went on. And eventually, I think they sort of started to figure it out. Like the third set of Fellowship block, this caused other problems, but like a bunch of fierce Uruk-hai led by Saruman could deal with the big Fellowships. That was a way, because they did enough damage, they put enough wounds out there, they could actually accomplish that. But all the cool Nazgul tricks, like you can't heal, and here's a blade, and all this cool sinister stuff, they'd just be like, all right, well, Gandalf's going to die. Here comes Aragorn. Oh, Aragorn's dying now? Whatever. Here comes Boromir. And it just didn't really function. So and because that was an issue with the fundamental foundational architecture of the game, the best thing that they could do was introduce cards that punished people severely for the Fat Fellowship. And I can't really blame them, right? Like that is not a fun card to have to go up against, but neither is every deck being as many. Like it restricted the amount of cool, interesting decks on the low end, the Twilight sneak decks, the we're going to try to creep to the end. Just they weren't strong enough to hang.
So on that note, I know, maybe X-Wing is the example, maybe it's not. I know that's an extensive, I just witnessed it and I know you were involved in it. So it's easy to reference, but when you get in that situation, because not every game that gets designed, for any would-be designers out there working on a game right now, I think it's a sort of a trap response, because you get to a point and you have certain principles or themes you're wanting to uphold and you're not wanting to ban and all these kind of things. What do you do and what don't you do as a designer in that moment? What is the right answer? Even if you were Lord of the Rings back in the day, fundamental mechanics are just off for some reason. You can't really go back and change the core rules. There's too many cards out. We talk about all the downsides and the issues with silver bullets, but what do you think there's alternatives?
I think it depends on the game. I think in general, I prefer bans, honestly. If something is so broken that it just is upending, obviously this doesn't apply to something like too many characters, because you can't just I mean, although we'll talk about that in a second. But if there's a specific card or set of cards that is causing a huge headache, and Magic learned this lesson pretty early on, you just say, I'm sorry. Oko, Thief of Crowns, crazy. What were we thinking? Sorry about it. He's banned. Oh, is he busted in this format? Okay, he's banned in that format. Oh, is he busted in every format? Sorry, he's banned from Magic. Because that's exactly what happened. There's literally not a even Gladiator, which is a 100-card, no commander singleton format. He is too busted for that format and is banned, which is bananas. It is bananas that a card that good ever made it out of the gate. But regardless, that was the best solution, rather than try to create some sort of anti-Oko hate card or whatever. Rotation is your friend as a card game designer. I think Netrunner really erred by not having rotation until far too late in the cycle, because you're stuck with you're going to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. You can be the best developer designer in the world. You're going to come out with a card that's just too good. It's just going to happen. And because there's too many variables to consider, there's never enough play testers compared to like a wide release audience to actually find this stuff, find all of it. You can catch a lot of it, but so I would say a ban is, generally speaking, if it's possible, better than a silver bullet. But if you are going to do a silver bullet, the way to do it is to think it out very carefully, and it needs to have some broad utility. Ideally, it will be a pretty good card in and of itself, so that you don't feel bad about taking it. So I will use an example from Legion, which is not a card that I designed, but it's a card that Luke Eddy designed. And it's a wonderful card. And I think it's one of the best silver bullet cards that I've ever seen. This is Darth Maul's Duel of the Fates. So to give a little bit of context for people who don't play Legion, Jedi characters gain a tremendous amount of advantage from dodge tokens. Spending dodge tokens gives them huge defensive bonuses. It's one of the ways that they stay alive. It's one of the ways that they activate a lot of their special force powers and abilities. It's sort of the bread and butter defensive token that they need to acquire in order to do all their cool stuff. So this card, Duel of the Fates, says Maul gains 1 dodge token and disengage. While Maul is engaged with an enemy unit, which is in base-to-base close combat fight, that unit cannot spend aim, dodge, standby, or surge tokens. So you get him into grips with somebody, you shut down their tokens. It's a once per game effect. It lasts for 1 turn out of 6. And the reason I love this card so much is it does so many cool things for Maul and for the game. So first of all, it gives him a nice little buff in that he gets a dodge token, and he's a force using lightsaber character. So he gets a lot of benefit from that. It gives him disengage, which the normal engagement rules state that you cannot leave a fight that you are in without spending your whole turn doing so. So it lets him just walk into and out of combat, which is huge for getting him where he needs to be. And then it says, while he's engaged with an enemy unit, shut down all of their cool stuff. The reason this is such an elegant card, the reason I love this card so much, is it's a theme win. Because what is Maul good at? What is his whole deal? Well, he hunts Jedi. Okay, awesome. But this card is good for a lot of stuff, not just, if they can have no Jedi in their list, and this is a damn good card. It's great to stop a unit from spending tokens. It's great to get him out of combat. It gives him a dodge token. Like, fundamentally, some pretty bread and butter utility just baked into the essence of this card. So you'll be perfectly happy to play this card, even if they're not using a Jedi at all. But if they are using a Jedi, this tells them, keep that guy away from Maul, or make him burn this card early, or do something to mitigate this, because this is a heavy hit to pay. The other thing that keeps this card very reasonable in my mind is that it applies to an extremely specific set of circumstances. You have to get engaged with the unit that you want to use it on. You have to play it in your command phase in order to activate it. So you have to time it right. You have to make sure that you're using it when you want to use it. And it's temporary. This is not an all game thing. This is something that they can play around by staying away from Maul, or by beating you in the, if they play a 1-pip, or they play even better, like a 1-pip with cunning or something that lets them go first, they can mitigate this. It's not a guarantee. So this, to my mind, I don't know if it's like the gold standard of silver bullets, but when I was looking through like all the cards and games and stuff that I worked on, this is the one that stood out to me as my favorite, because I think it's what a silver bullet should look like.
Well, I like it too, because it plays into like you're talking about, the fundamental game mechanics are still in place. So that what it's doing to answer a problem is still within that framework. It'd be different if that Maul ability you're talking about says discard a Jedi from the table. Right? Like,
yes, exactly.
It might effectively do that every time, where they can't spend dodge and now they just get hammered and they're off the table. But at least
there's a good chance, but you have to fight that fight.
Yeah, you get that epic moment.
Even
right?
if you're in the even if you're in the worst situation, even if your opponent playing Maul has done everything right, you still get to roll dice. You still have a chance.
Yeah, and it sounds like, just listening to you talk about these cards, like hate card, like things that typically counter specific things or strategies, and silver bullets are very much the same, but it's effectively a spectrum, right? There are cards that are better against certain strategies than others. But as those cards get narrower and narrower and stronger, those two things kind of go together. As they get narrower and stronger, like Plascreep is very narrow and very strong against the thing it was countering. That's when it gets into that silver bullet territory where like it's gone too far on that spectrum of countering or hating on a strategy to actually be productive to the game's design.
Yeah, and I have a similar feeling about Circle of Protection, Swamp Walk, Island Walk, like anything that's so narrow. Or Fear. Fear is another good one from Magic, which is you can only be blocked by black creatures. Anything that is too narrow in its application and too powerful in its effect is going to be a problem.
Yeah, man, Game of Thrones, calling your name. King Robert's host can't do power challenges. Cersei can't do intrigue challenges. Before we go to the lightning round, which of course we can't wait to do, give you a free reign on these 6 other mechanics that we've outlined. Can you give us a little idea of what you're up to? Like, how are you? I think most of our audience probably hadn't heard from you in a few years. We know you've moved to a different career of sorts. Can you tell us anything about what you're up to?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, I got laid off at Fantasy Flight in the sort of early stages of the pandemic back in 2020. The whole minis team got the boot in favor of atomic mass games. So there were a lot of us sort of floating around out there at the same time. I was lucky enough to land a rather interesting position at WizKids. So I am the director of miniatures games at WizKids, which I would kind of describe as a very new position for me, because prior to that, I was a developer and a designer, and I would concentrate on specific projects and bring them to fruition. Like I would work on X-Wing or, designed Legion and then developed for that for many years. Now I am what I will describe as an editor, and much like an editor at a newspaper looks at a bunch of stories and tries to make them better. That's kind of the role that I am fulfilling right now. I'm plugged into numerous games. I'm talking with numerous developers out there and working on a whole bunch of different exciting projects. And I do still get to do a little bit of development work and work on my own games as well. So it's a pretty cool position, and I'm really enjoying it. Especially since some of the developers that I have been working with most closely are a real joy to work with and are working on really exciting stuff. I'm in that weird transition stage where this is like the first time in 10 years where there's like a dead zone of no Alex Davy products coming out in the near future. And we're finally through all this stuff at Fantasy Flight. All the stuff that I worked on at Fantasy Flight has now been released with the last few Legion drops. So for the first time in a long time, there's stuff that I've worked on, but that I can't talk about too much because it won't be released for a little while. But there is one thing that I can talk about, which is coming up. Again, no firm release date on this, but sometime in the next 6 months or so, there's a really cool new minis game on the horizon called Dungeons and Dragons Onslaught, and it is a very classic grid-based player versus monster versus dungeon skirmish game. Really simple to put a crew together. You just choose 5 characters, each of whom has to have a different role, like Vanguard tank or melee damage, range DPS, that kind of thing. So it's taking some cues from that kind of video game squad building. And the really interesting thing about the game is that the list building is so simple, but it's one of those games where the round to round strategy is really, really interesting, because you loot treasure chests and get random treasures that can really change the course of the game. There's AI controlled monsters that you kind of pass back and forth between you and your opponent, so that you can hassle them with big gnarlies. There's a cool initiative system that's really well thought out. So that is a lot of fun. I'm very excited about that. Working with Nick Yu and Travis Severance on that game, they're the 2 designers, has been a real blast. And I really look forward to whenever that comes out.
So cool. That sounds great. Was D&D a part of your life previously? Like, did you do a lot of role playing?
Yeah, but it's sort of a return. It's a real return for me after a long gap, because I was a dungeon master in high school, and I spent a ton of time designing adventures and getting into writing my own rules and scenarios and designing my own monsters and all this cool stuff. But probably around junior year in high school, I just got too busy. There's too much other stuff going on. I was working at the newspaper, trying to get ready for college, doing, pre-adult stuff. And when I got to college, same story, too busy. I found it a lot easier to keep up with competitive games. I felt like that was in a lot of ways too what drew me in. So I was playing Lord of the Rings trading card game a lot in freshman, sophomore year. but I was also starting to get into games like Warhammer 40K and Warhammer Fantasy and that stuff. So the role playing thing, I think I maybe played one smallish campaign in college, but it's been, and this is sort of still kind of shocking to me, it's probably been like 20 years since I really did any role playing.
Yeah.
And so of course I played certain D&D video games and have a great affection for the source material, and played the Magic the Gathering D&D set, and that was cool, and all that. So the world, I think, is still really appealing to me. But in terms of actual role playing, I have an online game set up with some of the people that I used to play with in high school, and none of us have played in ages, and it's going to be interesting. So I'm actually going to finally get back into Dungeons and Dragons with some 5e coming up. But of course, having worked at WizKids for a year at this point, like, I've learned a lot more about D&D, and I've played a lot of Onslaught. So I have a much greater sense of that universe than I would have even a few years ago. But yeah, it'll be interesting. We'll see if I've still got those old RPG chops. I don't have to be the DM either, which is exciting, because I almost never got to be a player back in the day.
That sounds like a fascinating title, man. We'll keep our eyes on that for sure. And then it sounds like you've got a lot of other stuff coming. So get ready for the Davy Lanch.
Yeah, that's right. Give me a year or so, and then it'll be a lot of stuff coming out. There's some really exciting stuff that I sadly can't talk about, but someday we'll get back together and I'll fill you in when I'm allowed to do so.
Well, hopefully none of the remaining Power 7 mechanics we're about to lightning round you on are present in any of these games, or at least not in a problematic way. Let's run them down, man. Just quickly give us your thoughts on each of these as we go, and we'll interject if needed, but otherwise you kind of have the floor on these to wax as poetic or as candidly as you'd like. Let's start with recursion as a mechanic. What triggers in your mind as a designer when I say recursion?
Fun but dangerous. It's a fine line. That is a needle to thread. Really neat to be able to bring your stuff back. Part of a lot of really fascinating strategies. Important in a lot of cases if there is a lot of destruction mechanic in the game and a lot of things that are depleting your resources. But obviously, it's one of the most broken things when it's abusable and most frustrating, because if you're making negative progress against someone despite doing a whole bunch of things, it's a super big feels bad. So there was certainly a point in the history of Netrunner where recursion for the corporation was absurd. But there was also a point in Netrunner when destruction for the runner was absurd. So, early days, Noise showed up, and it was far too easy for him to throw stuff into the archives, to destroy the corpse top deck and just fish stuff out of the trash. But then it went too far the other way, where you got to the middle of Moonbad Cycle, and there were just half a dozen insanely strong recursion cards that would basically set up an impossible scenario for the runner, where they could not trash the corporation's assets fast enough where the corp could just bring them back. And that was one of the most miserable times to be a runner in Android Netrunner history. So it's a tough line to walk, because you need a lot of times. It's a fun mechanic, but it is one of the most oppressive feelings in the world to watch someone just say, cool, you wrecked my thing, it's back. And all these other things are back. And now you're out of stuff that removes them. So cool. Good luck with that. So yeah, dangerous, fun, but dangerous. Tread carefully.
Makes total sense. Like that you talked about Lord of the Rings, because Decipher's really big on this next one, which is memory taxing effects. These are things like board states that don't have a limit, tons of floating information, static buffs, etc. How do you as a designer approach the problem of players having to remember and keep track of a lot of things on the board?
I hate having to do that. I'm bad at it. I try to not design anything that requires it. It's just the short answer to that question. One of the reasons I'm better at miniatures games than I am at card games, and I'm pretty good at competitive card games, but I'm probably never going to be the best, because I don't have the kind of brain that can remember everything that's been played, math out what's left in the deck, figure out what the likelihood is to draw this or that, in order to plan my next moves. I'm very instinctual at games, and that gets you pretty far, having a good instinctive sense of what you should be doing, but it does not get you into the top echelon because you need that memory set, that stuff to function. So minis games are easier for me. Everything's on the table. I don't have to remember percentages or think about what might come out. And consequentially, and this is probably more to do with my own personal abilities and biases, I don't design a lot of memory intensive stuff in anything that I ever do. It's not to say that it's necessarily inherently a problem. It's just not something I'm fond of, and therefore I don't tend to engage with it.
All right, moving on to denial. These are, I think, the best way to explain denial mechanics, because in a certain frame of mind, anything can be a denial mechanic, but these are things that their sole purpose is to prevent your opponent from doing something they want to do rather than you doing something that you want to do. What do you think about denial in general?
Well, I'm an old school blue-black player, so again, take this with a grain of salt, but I like it. I mean, again, you have to be careful. You don't want something that shuts down everything. There's obviously been numerous times in Magic where denial became too strong and you could create a perfect defense, and that's a real feels bad. But it's a fun mechanic, and it's a sort of a necessary counter to all of those things that people are trying to do. And whether that's a counter spell or a removal spell, whatever it is, it's sort of a necessary counterbalance to all the things that they're trying to do. I think the game would be very dull if it was just, I play stuff, you play stuff, sometimes our stuff fights, right? You need some more different strategies, you need some more interesting angles on things. So like anything else, it's a dangerous mechanic. You can't let it go too far. You can't let denial be the only strategy or easily like the single best strategy. There was a time in Magic that creatures were essentially useless because they were so undervalued compared to spells and removal cards and denial cards. And over the last few decades, they have pumped creatures up to where they're on. I mean, you look at a creature from modern Magic and you go back to like Ice Age or something, and it's unreal. Like, it's unbelievable what a rare creature looked like back then, which would not even be a common. They wouldn't even print them today. So bad are they in the early days. So it's just one of those things. The more you learn about your game, the more you understand your own mechanics, the better you can fine tune this kind of thing. So there's no problem with denial. You just have to not make it be the best and only strategy.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned both Magic and Netrunner, because this next one, which is resource cards, both do this to a degree. And I think it has a different impact on each game. But what do you think about resource cards in the sense that the ability for a player to scale up into their stronger things is necessitating them drawing resources from the deck to do that?
That's a great question. I think those are the two games that I would have naturally used as an example anyway, because I still hate the land system in Magic. I think it's one of the worst things about the game. I really like the game, and they've done a lot of things to improve this. There's a lot of ways to fetch land, and lands have more utility, and mana has been smoothed out in a lot of cases. And there's some argument to be made for the fact that running multiple colors is harder because you need the mana base to be, you're more likely to not have what you need to cast stuff the more colors you add. I think there's something to be said for that. That's a cool balancing thing. But in general, having to stuff the resources into the deck and then draw those resources to do anything is real feels bad, because sometimes you just draw all lands and sometimes you draw none. And those are two games that you just can't win. So that's just a fundamental flaw in the game of Magic that we're all stuck with from now until eternity, because they will never change it, and nor should they. But it is what it is, right? It's my biggest critique about the entire game. And as the number one really, competitive card game for us nerds ever, it's one of those things that's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way. So I was very, very happy when I started playing Netrunner and realized that, oh my God, I can just click for a credit. That is so great. Or I can just click to draw a card. I think that is such a brilliant system. And the other nice thing about Netrunner is that Almost all of the, now obviously there were hits and misses, and there were times when either runner or corp economies got out of control. But as a general sort of philosophical approach, the really cool thing about corporation economy was that the runner could go and mess with it. You want to play a mining company that you can spend your whole turn clicking for credits. Well, you have to play it the turn before or find an extra click somewhere. And then the runner has a whole chance to go and get rid of it. And that is the beauty of Netrunner. It's anything you create can be destroyed. And any resource that you come up with, there's generally some good counterplay to that. Now, there were mistakes. I think Magnum Opus was always too strong because it was one card that did everything. And it was in a faction that could just, for reference, Magnum Opus was just, normally you can click for 1 credit. Magnum Opus, you can click for 2. Just doubles your economy. And it was kind of expensive, but not that expensive. And it was kind of memory intensive, but not that memory intensive. So that is an example of a resource that just, it sidestepped everything too well. And it was too hard for the corp to get rid of. But in general, Netrunner is a huge, and the funny thing is these are both Richard Garfield games, right? So he clearly learned from the initial issues with land and magic. And he created a much better, healthier, more fun, less frustrating economy in the very next competitive game that he designed, which is, hats off to him. He's amazing. But yeah, there's a huge gulf between, gosh, I hope I draw a land off the top of my deck, and, oh shoot, I didn't draw whatever, I'll just click for credits. Like that's the difference in feels good and feels bad in those two scenarios. I cannot overstate that, how different that feels.
And what's crazy is the more modern of the Garfield designs, like Keyforge, just dropped the mechanic entirely.
Yep. Which is very interesting, right? Like Keyforge is a great example. It's like, oh, just play whatever you want, as much as you want. Now it's limited by card draw. So I suppose one could argue that there is still a resource mechanic and it's cards. I think that's a fair argument to make, but it's so much more generous, right? Like it exists, but it's under the hood. You don't have to think about it. You can just do what you want. And that's one of my favorite things about Keyforge. Exactly.
And worth noting that even Magic cards are a resource, right? There's literal resources through mana, but it has the same problem, which is you still need the cards to play when you get the resources. Keyforge, of course, limited down to that single resource of cards. But yeah,
and they're much more generous, and they're much more generous card draw. Like that's the other thing, right? Like Netrunner solves both of the Magic because Magic is miserly in 2 ways, extremely miserly. One, mana. You have to get those lands out. If you don't, you can't function. Some decks can deal with having only a few lands better than others, but like fundamentally, if you draw no lands, you cannot win. And not only that, but there's no way to, let's say you have a bad opening in Netrunner. You've mulliganed and it's still bad. Well, you can just draw. You can just spend a bunch of clicks drawing and making money. Like it's not a great start, but you can recover. In Magic, you literally just sit there, do nothing, draw a card, and slowly or quickly lose the game. Or you get to the midpoint and it's like, oh man, I've got a handful of awesome 4 drops or 5 drops. And I just need that one land and everything will be good. It'll all be gravy. And then turn after turn after turn goes by and you just don't get it. Very, very, very miserly. Now they've done a lot to fix this over the years. They've learned a lot. There's a lot of draw cards now. There's a lot of mana fixing. They've gone treasure crazy lately. If you've been following along with Magic, friggin' everything makes a treasure token now, which I don't actually have a problem with because it's an obvious fix. It's an obvious patch to not being able to have the stuff that you need. And there's cards that draw cards and create treasure tokens. Deadly Dispute is a staple because it's a 2-cost card. You got to sacrifice a creature, an artifact or whatever, but you get 2 cards out of it and you get more treasure. So like they have figured out a lot of clever ways to mitigate the incredibly frustrating base design, but the base design is still incredibly frustrating.
All right, moving on. Last 2, we've got limit 1 per deck as a balancing mechanic, specifically not necessarily as a thematic mechanic, like the One Ring. You might expect there's only 1 in the deck, or at least certainly 1 in play. But we saw this even with in Netrunner. We saw Shards, where limit 1, I think that was more of a thematic choice than it has been in the past. but you probably around during the Warhammer Conquest LCG, where there was a number of the warlords or the commanders that had these limit 1 attachments, and they were often extremely strong. And so we've seen throughout the years in a bunch of different card games that, it seems like designers might say, well, if it's too strong, we'll just make it less common. So how do you feel about that as an idea?
I'm mostly fine with it. With, again, the caveat that if you feel the need to limit something to 1, you better be very sure that you're doing it for the right reasons and you're not just unwilling to change the card so that it's not as strong. But no, I have no problem with it. Like the Utopia shards, a once per game powerful effect is fun, as long as it's not too powerful. And it's just another lever, right, that you have as a game designer or developer to play with. And I will extend that theory to cards that break the deck building limits. Like Netrunner had Spy Camera, which you could take, I think, 8 of. And that was cool too. It was not, not typical to be able to take more than, I think, Netrunner was 3 cards, right? Yes.
Yeah, it was 3.
It's been a minute. Yeah. So you could normally you could only take 3. I think you could take 6 Spy Cameras. And it was a pretty hyper specific deck that would want to do that. I ran a Geist deck that loved its in Spy Cameras. But yeah, messing with the core list restricting or whatever number of cards you can usually take, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just another cool bit of space to play around in. But I think it's better when it's planned out that way from the start. And I think it's even better, or rather than as like an after effect, right? Like there's a difference between planning something like Utopia Shard, which was always conceived of as a one of, and it removes itself from the game. Like not only is it a one of, you can't recur it. It's very specifically designed to be one cool thing and then it's done. Versus an after effect balancing mechanism where you're like, well, we don't want to ban this card. Now you can only have 1. That's less elegant and it probably means the card is too good. And you just didn't have the guts, Stephen. You didn't have the guts to just ban it.
I think that's usually how those things go. Yeah.
Lastly, one last thing on the limit 1. I like it when it's basically secret, right? Like I like it on named characters. I like it when it's thematically sensible to only be a one of. That makes it feel better. It makes it feel more intentional. That's basically how all the command cards are designed in Legion. I knew that they were only going to go on, 1 or 2, maybe 2 in the future characters. They're once per game, but it's part of the core system. So everyone expects it. And if there's a command card that's really, really, really good, at least you only have to see it once, right? Like you're going to see it every game because you don't even have to draw it. You always have it, but it's not something that's going to happen over and over and over again.
That's I was going to follow up with a question there because I was going to ask if the command cards, you start with all of them. I think where we often have issue with it is when you have a 60 card deck and you have one card that's a limit 1 of, because it's so Conquest was the premier example.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of the resource issue in Magic, which is if I draw my 1 of item and you don't, I have a really unfair advantage. Vice versa is true. If neither of us draw it or both of us draw it, it can be an intense, epic game. But same here, where that's a little different, and that is thematically built in. It's character driven. Mm-hmm. It's your main character. It's a big moment. Everyone has the big moments, and it's a matter of when do you spend the big moment, not whether or not you're ever going to see the big moment.
Yeah, I think that's another issue too, right? Like, it depends on what kind of game we're talking about. A miniatures game where you have access to the thing from the start is a very different proposition than a game in which you may or may not see it. It depends on the format too, because I love a singleton format. I love Commander. I love, if I'm doing online stuff and playing Arena, I love playing Historic Brawl because it's 100 cards. And the cool thing, but every card is unique, right? Like every single card is just one. And so it's exciting. Every draw step is exciting because it could be one of 100 different things and you can never plan on anything. You have to stay flexible. But a one of in a 60 card deck where everything else can be 3 or 4, for example, in order for that to function, the effect can't be too powerful. Like it sounds like I never really played a ton of Conquest, but it sounds like the cards were probably too impactful. And generally speaking, like the more universal, the better. So like, again, to talk about the shards were not auto includes, even they were one-ofs, because it let them do a cool effect that you wouldn't want to put a bunch of them in the deck. But it was still not an auto include. It was like, do I have a deck that can benefit from this shard? Like when I was playing my max hand destruction deck, I love being able to do an extra 2 cards, situationally. But there were plenty of decks where I would never take it. So that to me feels like a reasonable thing. And it's a reasonable way to stop something that you think is a cool and balanced design, but only if it shows up once and removes itself. So it's tricky, but definitely a valid tool. I would say I wouldn't have a blanket rule against limit 1 anything. I think it's a perfectly fine lever to be able to pull.
It's tricky. Seems like kind of the thesis statement here in all of these interviews with designers.
Man. Slippery slopes.
Game design is hard. Game design, it's a lot. It's hard. It's really, really hard, especially trying to balance a competitive game. I have a huge respect for, and I'll just use this opportunity to say, like, if I have talked about something on here, and for some freak reason, someone who had anything to do with that mechanic is listening, don't worry. I've made my share of oopsies and mistakes, and it's just part of the job. It's hard to avoid. I'd like to think that I've learned a lot over the 10-ish years I've been doing this and make fewer of those mistakes, but I'm still going to do it. I'm still going to create stuff that's too powerful. I'm still going to, come up with core mechanisms that are almost right, but not quite, that I wish I could go back and change. Pierce. But, it's part of the deal.
Well, we'll
it's
finish
a tricky
here
business
with maybe the trickiest mechanic of all. And this is, we just kind of tongue in cheek call this free in quotation marks. Generally dealing with anything that's getting around cost or that doesn't have a limit to it, like play your next card for free. Where a card might cost 5 or 8 or 10, and the scalable cost that you've given something as a designer, you also introduce something into the ecosystem that removes that cost. This obviously, I think, of all the things that can go wrong in a game, I think most of us have seen this more often. Things are just too easy to play, too free. What do you think about that concept as a designer? Something that has its cost reduced or otherwise removed?
Well, it's hard to think of something that is genuinely free, right? Like because if we're using card games as an example, a card is a cost. So even a 0 cost Magic card has a cost. You have to spend the card. You have to play the card. You have to draw it. There is a cost, however low. I struggle to think of something that is genuinely free in gaming. Do you have one?
I have an example. In Star Wars Destiny, set 1, we had the Millennium Falcon. Upgrade comes into play, and each turn, basically, you can activate it to roll its die into the pool. So once it's in play, it doesn't cost you anything. I mean, you activate, that's the cost. And then when you resolve the special symbol on its die, you can play an event from your discard pile. Recursion, first off, but play it from your discard pile.
There's a couple dangerous things that you've already mentioned with this mechanic.
For free. So you could literally each round play an event in your discard pile of any cost. There's a time cost towards activating the Falcon and getting the right die or whatever.
And playing the Falcon to begin with, of course, is a deck building and resource cost. But yes,
but
once you have the machine,
it's free.
Once you have the machine built. And I think that's the key, right? Like, you shouldn't let players build machines that just start. The problem isn't the one-off free thing. It's being able to set up via recursion or play the top of your deck for free, whatever that thing is. You need to make sure that it's not some sort of horrific infinite loop thing, right? And as I recall, it was pretty difficult to remove something like the Falcon in Destiny, maybe not even possible in the beginning. So the problem is
impossible.
Okay. So there's a couple problems with that card, right? That card is probably just fundamentally too strong. But the other thing is that it never ends. If that was again, limit 1, if that was an on play effect, sure, probably not an issue. if it removed those cards from your discard pile when it used them. Now that's a double effect. That's not infinite. That's so basically what I'm getting at is like, put some bumpers on your abilities, guys, developers, folks, everyone out there. Just put bumpers on. You're gonna, even if you think it doesn't need them, just do it. You probably do, you know. So here's an example of an effect that is for free that I love. So I've been playing this a lot. I've played this card since it came out. It's a Magic card that I'm in love with. It's called Cody Voracious Codex. And it does a lot of things really well. And it's really beautifully balanced. It's probably not even that good a card, but that's part of its charm. Because it can be very, very good in the right situation. So what this card says is, it's a 3-cost creature. It's like a 1/4 artifact creature. While he's in play, you cannot play permanent spells. So you can't cast creatures, you can't play artifacts, you can't cast enchantments. You've got your little book guy, and that's it. But you can spend 4 mana and tap him to get 1 mana of every color. And then the next spell you cast, you cast the next spell, and when that spell resolves, you search you pull cards off the top of your library until you hit a spell that has equal or lesser mana cost to the spell you just cast, and you get to play that spell for free, which is crazy powerful. But it's balanced because, one, you don't know what you're going to get. It's like a slot machine. You have no clue. It might give you a penny. It might give you a time warp, right? Like you don't know what it's going to be. So 2, it's on a creature body that doesn't have haste, that you have to plug mana into and can be removed. So there's counterplay. There's a lot of things that you can do about it. 3, you can't ever know what you're going to get. You have no clue. I mean, you obviously, in a constructed deck, and I had a 60-card constructed version of this that did okay. You have theory building and numbers, and you have some idea of what you might get. But I've been playing him in Brawl in a 100-card deck, and I have no clue. It could be a lightning bolt. It could be so literally yesterday, I used him to cast Alrund's Epiphany, which is an extra turn and 2 birds. And the first thing that he drew was a time warp. So I got 2 extra turns, which is just bonkers. But that's literally a 1 in whatever, like a billion chance that will ever happen to me again. And that's why he's balanced, because there's checks and balances, because it's a really fun thing and a powerful thing, but it's not fully in the player's control. You got to go to the slots and hope you get lucky. You can rig the game to some extent, but you can't just continue to play. So what did you used to play with the Falcon? What were you always playing out of your discard pile?
Oh, I never played it because I have a soul.
Get ready for this. You know what's better.
Check this out. You're gonna love this. It's similar to a card you just mentioned, I think. So it's thematic. It's so thematic. But there was a card called Hyperspace Jump.
Oh, I remember this. Yep.
Usually costs 3, and it just ended the turn.
Yep. So you would do all your cool stuff real fast, and then you'd be like, later.
Yeah.
Yep.
And again, it's thematic.
Yep. Yes, it is. But not if you're doing it turn after turn, right? Not if you've set up your infinite loop. And that's the other thing. Like you just need some little caveat, right? Like if the Falcon had removed those cards from the game, it probably would have been just fine.
And I think they actually errata the hyperspace to when that card is played, it goes away.
Well, there you go, right? And that's another effective limiter. You just say, hey, this is, if you have recursion in your game and there's a card that's super strong, don't let it get recurred. That's Magic has taken that lesson to heart. All the really, really crazy spells exile themselves almost to a T. And if they don't, there's maybe something wrong with that card, and maybe they should have rethought it. Or it's just not a problem, right? But yeah, you just need some boundaries in your game design. They're good, and they prevent things from spinning out of control.
Yeah, I love the idea of bumpers. That's a good one to take to heart. Alex, it's been wonderful talking to you. I want to ask you one more thing, because you've mentioned it many times throughout the interview, of this concept of feels bad, right? And so I would like to know, what is your take on the role a designer of a game? What is your ultimate goal? What is it that you're trying to do for a player base? Because obviously you don't want to make them feel bad. So we've gathered that for sure. But how do you know, or how do you approach a design to say like, you know what, I did a great job on this because I accomplished X?
That's a really good question. And it's obviously extremely subjective. For me as a designer, obviously, I think that the most important thing is to create things that players have fun with, that are exciting, and that are going to be new and interesting and keep the game alive and lively and thrilling. A close second to that goal is like when I'm working on just about any game, but particularly games that have strong existing fan bases and are in a setting that is beloved and has very specific sort of internal rules, like Star Wars or Dungeons and Dragons, or any big fan base. You want to do that source material justice. You want Darth Vader to feel like Darth Vader and to be a force to be reckoned with, and you also want that not to get out of control. So you have to play this very delicate game where you want to hit on all three levels, right? You want theme, you want fun, and you want balance. You don't want people to hate Darth Vader because he destroys your army every time you see him, and he's not fair, and there's nothing you can do about it. You don't want Darth Vader to be a wimp because that's not cool. Like, that's not Darth Vader. What is this? Who designed this garbage? Like, what were they thinking, right? Like, and finally, yes, early X-Wing Darth Vader is a perfect example. Just a wet noodle, and nobody wants Darth Vader as a wet noodle. Like, that's not who he is as a character. And if that card had been anybody else, I would guarantee you I would have gotten 1% as much complaining about it, right? And that's an important consideration. If you're going to do a beloved character, the onus on you as a designer to get that right is so much higher. If that guy had been, Black 69 and he sucked, who cares, right? That's one card in a pool. But if you're working with any IP, like if you're designing a Magic card and it's a beloved Planeswalker, well, if they're a dud, people are going to be upset about it. But if it's some new card that no one's ever heard of and it's just binder fodder, well, not a big deal. So that's a consideration as well. But for me as a designer, I want a smooth, fun, interesting experience that tries to capture the theme of whatever it is I'm working on. And I don't want there to be too many rough patches, too many cards that just warp things too badly and take away people's enjoyment. Original Jumpmaster is a perfect example of something that was so overclocked that it just kind of ruined everybody's day. And it's hard to avoid those pitfalls. You're going to step on a rake sooner or later as a designer and a developer. And you just got to wipe your face off, shake it off, and try to do better the next time.
Awesome, Alex. Hey, thank you so much for taking the time. We hope to get a chance to talk to you maybe later whenever you got some more WizKids announcements to make. We'll be knocking on your door.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Anything else that you want to say to anybody out there before we get out of here?
Well, just anybody who's been kind of following along with my career, I want to say thank you. I've gotten a lot of really wonderful comments from people I've never met saying that things that I've worked on have made their lives a little bit better, and that means the world to me. That's it's not why I do this or why I got into it, but it's a huge part of why I still do it and why I feel good about doing it and feel like I'm doing something that has some meaning in a world that is kind of tough to take sometimes. So I really appreciate all that feedback. Thank you to my fans and to anybody who's been following along, and hopefully I will continue to do cool stuff that you'll enjoy.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Alex. It was great talking to you. And honestly, as someone whose life has been made better by a lot of your work, really just grateful for your work in tabletop and your existence in general, and you taking the time to talk with us today. I can't wait to see all these things that you've been working on coming out, and all the things you will work on in the future. Very excited about it, and hope you stay well.
Well, thanks, Zach. You too. It's always fun to chat, and we'll talk again soon, I'm sure.